Hello, and welcome to our program for September 11, 2021. This is our time of doing member favorites. As you may recall, in March, June, September, and December, we kind of have member favorites where we, instead of focusing on the current issues like we usually do, we kind of go back to some previous journals, some articles that have been missed or that people like that we can do it. Feel free to send in your suggestion to diving deeper. But we're delighted to have with us today to focus on an article that appeared in the March 2020 issue of the journal entitled Galileo and Global Warming, Parallels Between the Geocentrism Debate and Current Evangelical Skepticism About Anthropogenic Climate Change. And the authors, Rachel Roller and Louise Huang, are with us today. Welcome, Rachel and Louise.
Thank you, Randy.
Good to be here.
Okay, this is great. Now, Louise, you gave a talk on this topic at the virtual annual meeting a few months ago. So some of you may have heard her speak already, but the rest of you may not be familiar with them. So let's, as we usually do, let's take a few minutes to just get to know you a little better. Rachel, let me start with you. As I understand it, you're now at Notre Dame. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I'm in my third year of my PhD program in analytical chemistry.
Analytical chemistry, fantastic. Well, tell us just a little bit about how you got to Notre Dame in analytical chemistry. Where were you born and raised? Where did you start?
So I was born in Longview, Texas, which is in the part of Texas that has trees and hills. And
the only spot, yes.
Yes. Lived there for the first 8 years of my life and then lived in Kansas and Ohio for a bit. And then I did my undergraduate work at Azusa Pacific University, which is how I met Louise Huang.
Why'd you pick Azusa Pacific? You're out in the Midwest. How'd you get all the way out west?
So that is a definite God story. I hadn't really started looking for colleges yet, but I had a very specific list of what I wanted in a school. So I wanted a place that had a good science program, was preferably a Christian college, had an honors program, would let me play violin even though I didn't intend to major in it, and was hopefully someplace warm because I'd been doing dual enrollment classes in Ohio during a very frigid, snowy winter. So I had all of these on my list, but Azusa Pacific was not on my radar screen until my dad got recruited to be the business dean there. And so over Christmas break of what became my final year of high school, I did a college visit there. He did a job interview. We both decided that it was where God wanted us for the next few years. And I ended up in Southern California.
That's fantastic. That's a great story. So Azusa Pacific got two for the price of one in a way there. That's good. Yeah. So how did you get interested in analytical chemistry?
Well, chemistry is, I joke that it's because of the long cold winter in Ohio, which is partially true. So my 10th grade year when I was studying chemistry, it was one of the snowiest winters that we'd had in a long time. Mm-hmm. And so orchestra, Bible quiz, church, everything I did outside of school kept getting snowed out. And the more chemistry I did because I was bored, the more I liked it. So I finished my chemistry curriculum, 2 months ahead of time because I was having so much fun with it. I got to the end of the book and it said something like, well, if you got a C or better, you're probably decently prepared for college chemistry. And if you got an A, you might want to consider a career in it. And I thought, excellent. I need something to put in the little intended major spot on all the college mail I'm getting. Might as well put chemistry and I can figure out if I want to do something else later. So then when I started college earlier than I expected, I went with chemistry and never stopped.
That's great. That's a great story. Well, I want to come back to you a little bit later about how you got in this article. But first, let's get to know Louise Huang a little better. So, Louise, obviously you're at Azusa Pacific right now, right? Right. But what was your journey like? Where did you start?
Yeah, so I have a slightly longer journey. I was actually born and raised in Hong Kong, in the British colony that most know about. And I went to New Jersey for high school and stayed in the East Coast for college. So most of you know that, some of you know that I live in California now, but I am not, I'm a kind of reluctant Californian. I didn't really want to move to California. I don't know. I just thought they were wild and uncivilized. So, but I had a debate with God. He won, and somehow I ended up in California for graduate school, met my husband there, and then we trekked back to the East Coast for several years before we actually moved back to Los Angeles.
Where on the East Coast?
Let's see. I did my high school in New Jersey, and then I did my college in upstate New York, and then we were in Connecticut for 4 years.
Oh, now that's close to home. So you have to be a little more specific. Where in upstate New York and where in Connecticut?
So I was in Ithaca, New York. I was in Cornell for
Cornell. Yes, we do know that.
And then very different from very mountainous and very cold, very bleak winters. I moved to Davis, California. If you know, it's close to Sacramento, flat, absolutely hot, triple digits all the time. So we hit in the lab all the time. But had a really great time there as well. Okay,
so where in all that process and all that moving did you focus on your specialty, which you can tell us about?
Okay, that's a great question. So there's a thread throughout all those different places and experiences. I was very, very fortunate in my educational experiences. And my freshman year in college, my professor approached me and asked if I would join her research team. I had no idea what research was. I just thought, oh, that couldn't be a bad thing. So I signed up. But I was very fickle. I probably was more an undergrad student than a researcher. But I was very fortunate to publish my first paper with her. And I learned about environmental science through that. That was really the induction, I guess, into environmental chemistry, and also just understanding pesticides. That was actually my original project, how to detoxify pesticides. And that carried me through my master's and my doctoral work, also in the detoxification of pesticides. So that's how it got me really concerned and interested in environmental issues.
Oh, that's a great story. So you're teaching chemistry at Azusa Pacific then?
I teach an introductory chemistry course, which is called Chemistry and Society. So I feel like my job is really to convince the non-chemistry majors, non-science majors that chemistry is fun and important. So I have 15 weeks to do that.
I see. So Rachel, you were one of her students?
Actually, I never took a class with Louise Huang. I took organic chemistry with her husband, Kevin Huang. But I was a chemistry major, so I never had the pleasure of taking Louise's class.
Oh, okay. So I'd like to hear from each of you briefly. How in the world did you land on this particular topic of Galileo and climate change, and what led you to write this article? Let's see, who's first? Louise?
Sure. It is really God's timing. So I was very privileged to receive an external grant from the Scholarship in Christianity in Oxford, SCIO, which I am paying a tribute with my background. And so with this grant, it came the opportunity to do a research project. So I recruited Rachel because she was an honors, and she loves to read and write. And I think in our honors core, we actually studied Galileo. And I just asked if she was interested, and came with that opportunity was also time to study in Oxford. So Rachel and I actually were both in Oxford during the summer of 2018. So that was fun. So really, we were just thinking about how can we, and my topic and area is environmental issues. So we just thought, well, is there some way we can communicate this very, maybe even controversial, divided topic in a very winsome way, so that we can have folks from both sides of the aisle, if there is an aisle, to really engage in this very important topic. So I'll leave it there and I'll let Rachel fill in the rest.
So as Louise mentioned, she just walked up to me one day and said, "Hey, do you want to be my research assistant? And oh, by the way, this means you get to go to Oxford." And I obviously was not going to turn that sort of thing down. I was a double major in chemistry and humanities, which the humanities thing was a great books program. And as part of this 4-year journey through the great works, I had encountered Galileo and was fascinated by how strongly the situation in his time paralleled what it is today. And then in my chemistry program, before college, I hadn't really thought about climate change that much. And if you would have asked me if I thought that it was real, I probably would have said no. But as I learned more in college, I started to realize that maybe this was an issue, but I still hadn't made up my mind when Louise approached me about this. And so really, this whole research process was not only trying to figure out why things are the way they are in the world, but also me trying to figure out what was going on in my own head and what was causing my reluctance to accept climate science. So it was kind of a personal journey for me as well.
That's fascinating. And I want to get to our questions and the audience very soon. But before we do that, I'd like to follow up on what you just said, because one of the things I'm curious about is what were the factors or the data or information or influence that each of you personally had to convince you that climate change was real and anthropogenic and needed some attention? So Rachel, could continue a little bit. You said you were being skeptical and then started studying. What was it? Was there any specific datum or perspective that suddenly the light went on, or how did you get to recognize it?
So it was definitely more of a process than a light bulb moment. Part of it was just in each of my chemistry classes, there would be, a little tidbit about how this particular chemistry thing we were learning connected to something in the greater realm of existence. And sometimes that connection had to do with climate science. And so I started seeing how general principles that I knew from chemistry would support the things that I would hear on the news about climate science. I remember one specific moment. It was just an offhand comment by my physical chemistry professor. We had just had news reports of yet another hurricane that was bigger and stronger than would be expected. And she was just like, yes, this is exactly what we would expect from chemistry with climate change, because warm air holds more water and warm water has more kinetic energy. And that kind of flipped a switch in my brain that I had never thought about climate change having an actual impact on people. And so it's one thing when it's just like, oh, maybe it's getting warmer outside, but it's quite another when it's like, maybe this is contributing to the hurricanes that we're seeing. Maybe it's contributing to the wildfires we're seeing. So that made me start to think about caring more.
That's great. Okay. Louise, how about you? What convinced you that climate change was real and an important topic for us all?
I'm very grateful when I started teaching chemistry in society previously as introduction to chemistry. I use a textbook called Chemistry in Context. So we always start class with the conjure, the problem. And through that, we explore a lot of these relevant and current contemporary issues, such as climate change, ozone layer depletion, plastic, so on and so forth. So in that process, I was made aware that this is a really concerning issue with implications that Rachel mentioned. And especially thinking about teaching in a Christian university, that we're not just merely conveying the facts, that we need to point out the ethics and also any moral obligations within our Christian faith. So that gave lots of opportunities to integrate faith and ask questions, deep questions among my students. So what should we do about it? Should we do anything about it? And as a result, it would lead to these really deep discussion in a 100 level course, you would not think. And it's just always so robust and so enriching that let me think, well, maybe we should do more. Maybe we should research. Maybe we should pursue a bit beyond the classroom.
That's great. That's a great story. I have to admit, we're not here to talk about my view, but chemistry played a role for me as well. It started in 2007 when I had the privilege of going to a retreat with none other than Jim Hansen and Ed Wilson and a number of other players like that, and spending a few days with them, it kind of gets you. But I didn't really internalize it or convince myself of the final smoking gun until I saw the Delta C13 data for the atmosphere. And that clinched it. That to me is the smoking gun. Just looking at the atmospheric carbon dioxide and seeing how the change in carbon 13 matches the increase in overall CO2. There's no other conclusion you can draw. So chemistry is a good part for me as well. So at any rate, yeah, we've got a big challenge here. There's a lot going on. And at this point, I'm going to ask Becky to open the mics so that people can unmute themselves when they talk. So the ground rules, basically, we'll start with a written question. We've got one this program. And after that, if you want to ask a question, you go to the reaction, the reaction icon at the bottom, and click on raise hand. And I will then call upon you as in the order in which you raise your hand. And when I call on you, then you can unmute yourselves. And after you're done speaking, please go back on mute in that way. Okay, so our first question here is from Del Kuhn. Del, I saw you over here somewhere.
Yep, I've unmuted if I'm coming through.
There you go. There you go. Yes, go ahead.
I'm probably close to the same page the three of you are. And your article, I did a lot of thinking about your article, and I'm going to distill it and kind of follow my notes, but I'm going to end up with an economics question. I don't think one of your reasons for people denying science is they don't trust government or they're using non-scientific factors. And I don't think that's wrong with climate change because it is entirely intertwined with policies that are going to range from learning to live with a warmer planet to immediate strenuous efforts to reverse it. And I'm not a denier, but I do question large-scale government programs. With the climate, the dog that didn't bark has always been the lack of nuclear power for our electric grid. And I've thought that way ever since Kyoto, if not before. And instead, we're getting pushed to intermittent renewables like wind and solar. And I'm also going to say on the communication, instead of facts, we're getting scare tactics. And the White House's April announcement on the 2030 carbon reduction goals make my point better than I can. They use threat twice, including climate change as an existential threat, crisis twice, in support of opportunity 4 times and jobs 10 times. And that's not a science statement, that's special interest advocacy. Now, what I happen to like is Stephen Kunin's 2021 book, Unsettled, because I think he does a decent job of explaining the difference between what we know, what we don't know, how we know it, and what data is versus what projections are for models. And I've got a hunch that the non-scientific community doesn't know the difference between, say, the IPCC's model results in 2050 and Halley's Comet position in 2050. They're different. They don't have the same level of certitude. And I'm kind of hoping that pushing something like Kunin's book will bring the deniers up to the same page that most of the rest of us are on, but also his insight into how climate models are put together and what the uncertainties and assumptions go into them. I think that might help put at least rein in the imminent existential threat lobby that we're seeing. So here comes my economics question. As a complement to Kunin's physics approach to climate change, do you have any good economists that are taking a look at what we should be doing in terms of cost-benefit ratios. It looks like we're going to be spending $36 billion in the 2022 budget, and it's proposed to spend $2 trillion over the next decade combating climate change. So is there anything good out there on cost-benefit? What are we going to spend the money on? How much is it going to cost? How effective is it going to be? And that includes both the scientific uncertainties and the societal uncertainties of going along with the spending. And is there anything better? Or what happens if we don't spend that money on climate, we spend it on something else? Because with those numbers, we really ought to do, all of us on whatever side ought to be doing some serious thinking about where we're spending and not just dig into hardened positions. So my question is, where can we go for the economics to complement the science?
It's a tall order. Louise, Rachel, who wants to take us on first? Yeah.
So I'm not going to claim that I have good answers to this. What I will say is that this is the question. So my dad is a business professor. And so I have grown up with supply and demand curves sketched on napkins at the dinner table to explain everything in the universe. And I'm really thankful for that background, because even if you accept climate science and realize that there is a problem, then the question really becomes, now what do we do about it? And I like what you said, Del, about I'm not a skeptic, but I am skeptical of large-scale government intervention. I would also fall in that camp, frankly. There's a book put out by the American Enterprise Institute. I think it's called Abundant Energy. It's been a few years since I've read it, but it really talks about more market-based strategies for combating climate change and finding efficient energy sources. So if you want just a real tiny book that has these economics to go along with the science, that's a good starting point. Louise, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Del, for your very, very thoughtful question. While we are not economists, obviously, Rachel and myself, and I don't specialize in nuclear power, I think you mentioned that. Can I share with you something I shared with my class the first day, actually, when we established some kind of commonality when we talk about sustainability? Most people, when we talk about environmental issues and approach climate change, they mostly think about either the science or the environmental, ecological aspect of it. I emphasize that actually 3 pillars, or what I call the 3 E's. So the environmental or ecological aspect, the social or the equity, that not just for some living things, but all living things, and not just for some humans, not just the elite, but for all. And then finally, the economics, like what you mentioned, Del. So I hope that's the premise as we think about solutions that are meaningful and holistic in the long run. And while I didn't study the whole President Biden's budget on climate change, I noticed that the priority there really is to curb carbon emission, which we've been told with the latest IPCC report that we are really in an endangered area. So I believe the current administration is trying to rejoin and honor the Paris Agreement, and with major efforts to curb carbon emission. While it sounds so simple, it is far from it, because we have an infrastructure that is built absolutely the contrary. So there are so many different bullet points, sub-bullet points under that the administration is introducing and proposing. And that we leave to the policymakers. And I agree with you, Del. We should question. This is a democracy. We should question when things are being proposed. We have the voice, and I encourage my students to write to elected officials and ask questions and make suggestions. And I think this is a very healthy process, and that we should have informed discussions. Unfortunately, I think we have, and we wrote this article before COVID. I think COVID, if nothing else, has demonstrated to us the extreme importance of holistic science communication and how polarized we have become through this whole process. And climate change definitely falls into that category, being extremely polarized and politicized. So I really hope, Rachel and I really hope that through small projects like ours that we can engage those who are unlikely to engage, and that we can have some really meaningful discussion and meaningful resolution going forward, because it's going to take everybody, not just the scientists, the politicians, the economists, educators, and as such.
You know, it takes a lot of work. There's no easy answers there. And I think it's important, and you mentioned this, Del, too. What is the cost of not doing anything or not doing all of this? It's a lot of foresight that isn't very clear. Okay, I want to go to Marika, who's raised their hand. I just noticed in the chat a couple of people are asking questions there. Please use the raise hand button under reactions, and I can get you. It's a lot easier to catch you there than it is from the chat. But if you want to get your question raised, please do that. But Marika, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Randy. And I'm not following up on this previous conversation. I'm sure many other people will, because I'm not an economist either. And interfacing those parts is something that's highly problematic, not least because there are many, many different approaches to economics. And I think they're undergoing a paradigm shift at the moment as well, which I don't really understand. But getting back to the question of how the Galileo thing is similar to climate change, I'm coming from a background of satellite imagery. And as many people probably realize, it's the gathering of data since the 1980s, which is very quantitative, completely covering of the Earth, and able to be processed only really by algorithmic methods. That has contributed a great deal to the climate change debate. My particular research was in the changing spring phenology patterns of green up across North America. So while I didn't go into that having anything to do with climate change, it certainly got me right landed in the middle of it. But it seems to me the similarities between this and Galileo's time is that we have a sudden influx of vast quantities of new data relative to what had been there before, and also highly precise quantitative data which came in, which kind of forced a re-examination of the previous paradigms. I mean, if what you're trying to do is descriptive astronomy and predictive to the extent that you want to know where the comet's going to be, or you want to know where the planets are going to be, or where the stars are going to be for navigation purposes or astrological purposes or timekeeping purposes or whatever, the kind of broad scale, low data, qualitative theory of Ptolemy was becoming difficult. I mean, you could say that theory is fine. And look, we've got all this wonderful new data from the telescopes, from Galileo, from the calculations of Kepler. We don't have to say that the previous theory or paradigm of this geocentric and epicycles and all of that stuff, we don't have to say that's wrong. Just that, well, if you really want a better prediction than we've got right now for the future position of all these stars and planets, look, this data is going to help you. And I believe that ultimately was Galileo's defense, which in the beginning doesn't bother anybody, but with the accumulation of more and more and more precise, validated data, said, look, the new idea, the solar-centric idea, explains things so much better that we might as well say it's really like that, because we're going to have exceptions constantly to say it's not like that. And that process through centuries, really, as more data was accumulated and more data was processed, has been very accelerated with climate change. But I think it's the same process at hand. For a very long time, people could remain convinced scientifically, or at least plausibly skeptically scientifically, that anthropogenic global warming was irrelevant because these are long-term cycles, which there are, because we have interpolated our sparse data poorly, which we did. It's a spike. There were spikes, and so on. But as time went on and more data, more and more validated quantitative data accumulated, said, gosh, this looks like it really must be anthropogenic climate change. And once you admit that that's a possibility of the way things are really working, then you open up wonderful new questions, which are important and whose answers will help us in dealing with it.
Marika, do you have a question coming in there? We want to give time for others. We want to give time for others as well. But
absolutely.
Appreciate your comments.
Do you see a similarity between the Galileo thing that apply to climate change on that basis, simply the continued accumulation of vast amounts of data that force us to change our theory?
Definitely. I think you did a really good job of pointing out the parallels. I think the one difference is that when Galileo was on trial, they hadn't found the smoking gun of the Copernican revolution, which didn't come until a couple centuries later when we finally had accurate enough equipment to observe a stellar parallax. So when Galileo was on trial, yes, the preponderance of the evidence was for the new cosmology, and it certainly explained things a lot better. That's actually why this research was happening, is because people wanted calendar reform, because all of the calendars, none of them agreed with each other, and it was starting to become a problem. So compare that to now, when, a couple decades ago, like you said, we didn't have all of the data that we do now. And so there was a little bit more room for skepticism then. But as we've continued to see these trends going forward, I think we're about at the point of the stellar parallax, where it's becoming more and more difficult to hold on to skepticism in light of the evidence.
Louise, you want to add something to that?
And I think we also want to especially reach out to those, again, like I mentioned before, who would not engage. And we thought this could be one way when we do a parallelism study, and to see that, with that story, it took a couple hundred years. And with this current situation, do we have that much time, or how should we learn from the previous experience, especially within the church? So it was not just the scientific side of it, but it's also the faith-related issuest
Yes, Marika, if I can take my prerogative here of jumping in also, lest people leave with the notion here that it was the accumulation of additional data that swung consensus towards heliocentrism. I'd urge you to read Owen Gingrich's small book called God's Planet, where one of his first chapters is titled Was Copernicus Right? And he goes through a little bit, and he points out that not only wasn't there definitive scientific evidence for heliocentrism and at Galileo's time, but it was actually accepted before the scientific data really rolled in a couple of centuries later. And of course, this is Owen Gingrich's theme in that book, saying that it's metaphysical issues that influence why people accept certain scientific conclusions or not. Metaphysics is just as important here as the scientific data. So, and I think Rachel and Louise do a good job here of looking at both biblical interpretation and different issues in addition, political issues in addition to the scientific. So maybe we'll get back into that later. But I just wanted to interject that a little. Okay, thank you, Micah. Bill, good to see you here.
Good afternoon. I want to applaud the authors for including the politics part of it, both in Galileo's time and today, because that was my biggest stumbling block. I've been a delegate at 2 Republican national conventions, and with my conservative friends, even conservative Christian friends, most of them don't even look at the evidence because they don't like the big government solutions that have been proposed. The turning point for me was 5 years ago when I did a sabbatical at Villanova University, and I got exposed to a lot of people doing sustainability in major corporations who made the point that not only are we doing the right thing for the environment, we're making much, much more money by being sustainable and having less waste. And I think, at least with my conservative friends, I try to make the point that there are market-based solutions that will work in many cases. Not all cases. I think government still has a role in some places. But I just want to thank you for bringing that up, because I know that's a big issue for a lot of people.
So would you like to comment on Dell's question a little bit? Where do you think on the proposed budgets? Are we way off base, or is there a path forward?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I am. Yeah, you spoke up a question.
I think, I don't know how much the government really needs to do. I'm still trying to sort that out. But I do know that the marketplace can do a tremendous amount in terms of reducing waste and that sort of damage to the environment. So I'm hopeful about this rather than being pessimistic. I'm still not sure how big government needs to be to accomplish it.
Yeah, my only pushback on that, Bill, would be that market forces may play, but the benefits are probably too far out in time to influence near-term issues in the marketplace. That's kind of where I'm stuck. I mean, it's hard for the market to react in that sense.
Well, I'm not saying the market can do everything, but I think it can do a lot. And I think that's an approach that will work with your conservative friends, to say it's not just big government solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need everything. Okay, Rachel, Louise, you want to make any comment?
No, I think I agree. The problem is so big. I call it in class both from the top down. I'm not saying I'm endorsing big government, but we have to have some sweeping policies, and also from the bottom up. It has to be that way.
Okay, Oscar, good to see you with us. Let's hear from you.
Hello. Well, first of all, congratulations to the authors. I really liked reading your article. I'm a very big fan of creation care.
Okay. Go ahead.
Maybe we lost Oscar.
Oscar, looks like you froze on us. Maybe you can't hear. Let's see. Becky, maybe you can contact him. Let him know he froze in some way. So, all right. So while waiting for us to get him back, Dorothy Boris, glad to see you with us today.
Hello. I had my camera off for a while, but I've been listening intently. And I want to really talk a little bit about the use of the word skeptical and skepticism, because I often encounter people who say that call people alarmist. And I now say, I'm not alarmist, but I'm alarmed. And I do think that the data is very, very strong, that things are happening more rapidly than we had projected on several fronts. I'm an ecologist, I'm an aquatic ecologist, and I started knowing more about this back 20 some years ago when I was looking at small wetlands and they were drying faster because of climate change. The ones that I studied feed 50% of American wildfowl. And so I've seen this in my own field of expertise, just developing from we don't know that much to we really know a lot. So I guess I want to put out there that all scientists should be skeptical, but that skepticism changes a little as decades of data accrue as a group. And I feel like when we say I'm skeptical now, it really is more a response to not the data, but what we're afraid will happen. But what will happen is going to be experienced differently by everybody around the world. And so, Louise, your comment about equity, I think, is the thing that needs to come in here, because it's not going to be Americans who are most badly hurt, and it's not going to be wealthy Americans that are most badly hurt. So I do think that, I guess my question to the authors, and I love this paper, would be just how do we move something that is so political, not just because of the ideas, but because the economy is so interrelated, into back to the what does the science say, so that we can force everybody to say we do have to make decisions.
Great question. I can only speak from my personal experience here, in that when I was coming face to face with the data, there came a point where I was intellectually convinced that anthropogenic climate change was happening and that we probably needed to do something about it. But I still did not want to accept that because of those factors that you mentioned and that we talk about in the paper, mostly the none of my conservative friends believe this, and also what do we do about it economically, and if I believe this, am I going to be a earth worshipping hippie tree hugger? So for me, at least, some of it was just realizing, becoming aware of what was going on in my head, and that I was letting non-scientific factors like that cloud my perception of the evidence. That's one of the reasons why we wrote this paper, is just to bring understanding and awareness, both to people who find themselves in the position where I found myself, to realize these are the barriers that might be keeping you from this acceptance, and maybe they aren't good reasons. And also for people who are friends with those people. So now when I am talking with acquaintances who are more on the climate denying side, I can, rather than assuming that they are stupid or misinformed or intentionally denying the evidence, I can come from more of an understanding and sympathetic place of relating to them, and also start to speak in their language. So if someone is mainly concerned about the economics of it, maybe we can start with looking at the economic effects of climate change and the fact that the environment is not a free good. It should be factored into economic calculations. If I'm talking with someone who is concerned about the possible New Age earth worshipping thing, I can take them to scripture and show them where in scripture we find a case for creation care. So I think it's understanding where people are and then meeting them on common ground is how we start to change people's perspectives.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I absolutely agree with Rachel. I think especially after the pandemic that we've gone through, tactical empathy is so important. It's not just insisting what I know is right, but really listening to the person who's expressing concern. So where is the hang up? and to really try to understand. I think Rachel and I really feel very strongly that the church could be a leader in doing so, could model. And I am hopeful, I'm a hopeful and optimistic in going forward that we can truly be the light in where we're being called. I'm called as an educator. So in my sphere, I hope I am being faithful in helping my students understand these issues. And as a result, they hopefully would experience transformation and therefore can bring about changes. But I cannot force that. I think it is a very individual choice, but I think we have to remember the greatest commandments and really remind ourselves that we are loving and worshiping our God and then caring for our neighbors. Those have to be the undergirding in what we do.
That's great, Louise. Oscar, I see you're back with us. Would you like to continue your question when you got so rude?
Yeah. So, sorry. The internet connection here is not very good. Yeah, my point was that here in South America, we do not need to convince people or the church that there is climate change. Why? Because we're living it. Because here in the tropical areas, the weather is more stable and there are not so many streams as extreme summer, extreme winter. No? And now the phenomena like El Nino and others make the people that there is something wrong here. And when I have gone and talked to the churches about that there is a problem here and we must care for creation, the majority of people, almost nobody has told me, no, that's not important. They say, yes, this is important. We are looking that the poor suffer more because of flooding, because of the droughts, because the crops are lost and poverty is increasing. So in the US, now there are cases of evident damage of climate change, that is by forest fires, hurricanes, or something like that. Is it so difficult to convince the evangelical church, the Christian church in general, that it is necessary to do something? Why it is so difficult? That's my question.
I think we have alluded to that previously. This topic, climate change, has been so politicized. And we're seeing other examples of that, and that being so intertwined, and it's very hard to pierce out, oh, this is just science and we should just go by the facts. And I personally think that is one of the things. And we have fallen into those traps, if you would. And I think North American evangelicals, I think, is a little different than other evangelicals. I had a discussion with Richard Balcom when I was in Oxford, and he did point out that British do look at North American evangelicals a little differently, thinking that it is not quite what they think evangelicals are. He pointed out to me, he reminded me that John Stott, being an evangelical, that British would think that he is quite radical and that he is not playing safe. But somehow the term and the interpretation and also the manifestation look pretty differently. So if we can get past the politicization of climate change and other issues, I think perhaps we can go places.
Okay, thank you. Carrie.
I'm a little hard of hearing. Did you call my name?
Yes, I did, Carrie, all the way. Yeah, we're going from continent to continent. We went to South America. And now
Britain is such a small country that if we reduced our emissions to net zero, it would have a negligible effect on climate change. The UK government is spending huge sums of money on subsidies for electric cars and goodness knows what. And it seemed to me as a Christian, it's a total waste of money. Now, the three biggest polluting countries are India, China, and the United States. India and China are totally unable or unwilling to do anything much about it. I don't know the position of the United States. So it seems to me a Christian approach is not to try to fight climate change, but to adapt to it. And I think adapting to climate change, to global warming, is what Christians should be thinking about. One of the obvious effects of global warming is that huge areas of Canada, Russia, and North China will become cultivable, and huge amounts of food could be produced from there. But I can't really see that Russia or China or Canada are likely to accept millions of people coming from hot countries to become farmers. But if we're serious about adapting to climate change, these are the sort of things that we should consider.
Absolutely. In fact, I believe among leading climate scientists, they recommend that it is not just curbing carbon emission, but also adaptation, like you mentioned, Carrie, and also mitigation. And we have a small window to do that. I think if you haven't read the latest IPCC report, it is very extensive. I recommend that you will read the summary and to know where we're at. And if you don't, I think current events will probably remind us the calamities. And I think I briefly see one of the comments in the chat that the recent calamities increasing in frequency and severity, that would also remind us that we don't have infinite amount of time. So that is something that we have to consider when we consider what kind of approaches and what would be most fitting going forward. But yes, I think it's all of the above.
Can I ask how much global warming do you anticipate? What are the latest scientific estimates in 100 years? Is it 1 degree centigrade or 5 degrees centigrade? Because 1 degree isn't actually very much. 5 degrees would bring very serious problems. What is your current estimate?
If I may invite others who have read the IPCC report or know this better to also fill in. My understanding, Carrie, is that the IPCC last report, we were trying to curb at 2 degrees, and we are not quite hitting that. And right now, I think we are trying to stay below 2 degrees, but with some countries not supportive.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch what you said. How many degrees?
I think in the last report, in the Paris Agreement, it was at 2 degrees, but we were not really hitting that right now. So we are still trying to curb it at 2 degrees or less, but that is not very promising from what I'm understanding. Would anyone be able to speak into that further?
Can I speak now? I don't have any questions for Rachel and Louise, but my name is Carol Hill, and I teach climate change at the University of New Mexico, and I'm a colleague of Louise's. I just finished a book called The Physics of Climate Change. And if you don't believe that we are into climate change now, you better read this book. And Carrie, this book, this physicist goes into exactly how much temperature we can expect as we go along, because those factors are in the system now. And some of these factors last 1,000 years that he's talking about. He also talks about CO2 and the effect that it has and so forth. And, even if we start now, we're in big trouble. So as far as, being scared or skeptical or whatever, I think the time is to really start to listen to the scientists like physics, like chemists, like Louise, and geologists. I'm a geologist, and saying, we better do something about it. So anyway, I don't have a question for Rachel or Louise. I just wanted to put this book out. Well, I just finished it.
Carol, okay. Since you finished the book, you can give a number. Okay, Carrie wanted a number. So what's baked into the system How much is,
well, he
are we going to
goes
get? And how much do you think is realistic, and where can we be?
Well, he goes into that. It realistically.
Yeah, tell us the number.
Yeah, realistically, there is no number now because there's so many variables. But he goes into, hey, we're going to go 5 degrees and so forth, the way we're headed now. So that's okay. People disagree, but I'm just saying, look for yourself. Here.
All right. So basically, what you're saying is that if we don't do anything, we're headed for 5 degrees. If we do everything we want to do, it's 2, and somewhere in between.
You can't tell there's a lot of factors involved.
Right. Yeah, but we have to make Carol. We have to make an economics budget on some basis. You know, we have to decide.
If I'm just saying about the facts, if you want the facts, the physical facts of climate change, read this. And I'm not saying what we can do about it or whether we're going to change somebody's mind or not. I don't think we're going to change anybody's mind. But this is solid physics here. This is based on solid physics. And I think that Christians, as well as everyone else, ought to go by the solid physics. So,
okay. Thank you, Carol.
That's
Ken.
all I've said. I guess Ken's next here. He's a good colleague of mine.
Yeah,
too.
he is. How you doing, Ken?
I'm doing great. Of course, I first have to just say a quick hello to Carol Hill because she is the lead editor of our Grand Canyon book, but that's not the topic for now. I have been blessed to have my PhD in geochemistry from Wally Broker at Columbia University, who over the decades of his career has been one of the leading experts of carbon dioxide with his thesis work when he got started. So I've known of climate change now for 50 years. My questions that I want to come up to present, questions for the two authors here that are talking about their material, is I am in the context of reaching out to homeschool students, and I'd like to have some idea of how soon might sea levels, say, rise, let's say, to 1 foot. That would be devastating to the shoreline. And then as I'm speaking with homes, and I'm an advisor to homeschool curriculum of one of the organizations, what are the key bullet points I should be sharing with high school students about creation care and the impact of climate change with respect to temperature and sea level rise?
So thank you, Ken. I'll jump in and then Rachel probably can fill in. I'm just looking at the summary headlines from the IPCC report, the latest one from August. Temperature is the obvious one, but you brought up sea level rise and also the melting of sea ice, and also the loss of biodiversity. And I'm sure Dorothy can add more to that as well. Also, increased frequency of severe storms from droughts to hurricanes. So those are all consequences of climate change that we have seen being more serious in the last decade. And the report is predicting that in the possible climate future that we will see increased intensity of all of the above. And there are numbers. I can send you the links to all these numbers. And I think those are if you want to know the facts. Rachel, I think you have a couple of things you wanted to add, right?
Yes, if we want numbers from the most recent IPCC report, you asked about sea level rise. So there's several different scenarios. The best case scenario with very, very low greenhouse emissions is about 0.28 to 0.55 meters by the end of the century. And the worst case scenario is up to a meter. So that is definitely enough to be concerning, because if you're looking at places like Bangladesh, you have millions of people living in that 1 meter that will be covered by water under the worst case scenario. So that is one way you can connect with homeschool students. I was a homeschool student, and that sure would have connected with me if you would have told me that people were going to be refugees because of this. Also, going back to the IPCC report on numbers, we were asking for actual degrees Celsius.
Well, okay, pass on that.
Okay.
If I'm reaching Christian high school students, what are key bullet points that I should be sharing with them?
So things that would have convinced me would be, number one, just the data of how much CO2 and methane and such is in the atmosphere compared to the 1800s. So the baseline data. And then probably the most impactful thing would be the effects that are predicted. So things like sea level rise, ocean acidification, more extreme weather events, and that sort of thing. So showing not only the scientific data, but the probable impact on wildlife, human beings, the poorest among us, and really tying it to Jesus's command to love our neighbor as ourselves, that we can't sit here in our lovely air-conditioned rooms and ignore the problem when there are people who might be less fortunate who are suffering because of this issue.
Thank you very much. If you had something else to add, Louise, I'd listen.
All right. Okay, Jay. Unmute yourself, Jay.
I am. Thank
there
you.
You go.
Thank you very much. I'm having an interesting day. I mean, today I got up this morning and went with our church group and my autistic son to gather up branches from people's backyards from Hurricane Ida. Did you guys hear about that? It came up here. Oh, I know it. Went to New York. So that's why you heard about it.
New Jersey, right. Oh, did it hit Louisiana, Jay?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
We were very fortunate, actually. It jogged to the left just before it would have been the heaviest storm to hit Baton Rouge. But being a longtime ASAer, I still remember having in 1998 with Sir John Houghton. If any of you know who he was the first chairman of the interagency task force that presented stuff. And so we were talking on the side, and I said, are you optimistic that we're going to be able to do something about that? He says, well, I got to address Parliament. And Parliament, we had cocktails afterwards, and one of the guys, one of the members of Parliament came up to him and said, this is pretty good, bad stuff. I said, when do you think this all happens? Well, he says, start talking about, by 2050, we're thinking about and the guy said, he just calculated quickly how long he was going to be in office. And that was the end of that. And I have one of my best friends, I should say, is Senator Cassidy, who's our senior senator now. And he has a political problem too, because Baton Rouge economy is heavily on oil and gas. And we could cut down our and we have a lot of chemical plants as well. And our biggest emitters are not cars or air conditioning. It's actually these plants that are economically important for us. The other political issue is nuclear. I think nuclear power is great. It's wonderful. It's clean. The problem is, though, there are real political issues internationally. Is what happens if all these people are able to concentrate plutonium, and how does that all change? Anyway, then it becomes the issue of how do we think globally when there's no real agency to do that. And I think there is a lot of resistance among the Christians to think about international political organizations. I've raised enough questions. I'll shut up now and listen for the answers, please.
I'm glad that you bring up nuclear because one of my other professors at Azusa Pacific University, I took an environmental chemistry course with him, and one of his goals for the course was to show us that nuclear energy is a really great idea, but here are all the reasons why people are scared of it. I think it is important to note that the level of uranium enrichment that you need for nuclear power is significantly lower than the level of enrichment you need to make nuclear weapons. So, yes, there are national security concerns, but not nearly as much as one would expect, because it's a lot harder to make a bomb than it is to make nuclear power. I also appreciate your point about the time horizons involved. That I was reading in the Bible the other day when Hezekiah is told that his son's kingdom will be taken away, and he sits back and he's like, there's going to be peace and prosperity in my lifetime. And I feel like that is a pretty good picture of what we see a lot today, that it's easy to put off tomorrow's problems until tomorrow. But there's two reasons why that is a bad idea. The first is, obviously, that's not fair to the next generation. I will be alive in 2050 if nothing terrible happens, and I would really like to have an environment that's livable. And the other major problem is that we are already seeing effects. As was pointed out earlier, in South America, you're already seeing crop loss from this. And just last week, wildfire risk is increasing. And one of my old roommates was evacuated from her house for a week because of wildfires. And so when we start to realize that this is having real effects now, then it becomes something that we can't just put off until the future.
Okay, thank you. Peter, good to see you again.
Hi, yes. I was giving a course on environmental physics in the 1980s, and all of this was known about then. It's just that the world has been very slow to take real action and to become convinced that it's important. But one topic that was very much more alive then, and which to some extent has been dealt with, is the ozone layer and chlorofluorocarbons. Now, the world agreed we must do something about that, and they did something about it. So there is some degree of hopeful precedent that if people who care about the future of the world really press things hard enough, perhaps something will be done. But I don't think it's at all right to say, oh, well, what number are we talking about? Let's adapt, because it's not that things will just go up by some number of degrees and then stabilize. The problem is that as things look like, they won't stabilize. Things will just get worse and worse and worse. And so we just got to do something about it while it's less difficult, because it will be harder and harder to take action when the emergencies become more apparent. And that's what I would chip in with this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Peter. Louise or Rachel, you can probably only say amen to that, right?
Yes. And if I may thank Peter for bringing up ozone layer depletion. This coming Thursday, September 16th, is actually the International Day of the Preservation of the Ozone Layer that the United Nations and many countries around the world celebrate. So if you would celebrate that, is a hallmark resolution in environmental issues.
Okay, very good. Okay, next we have, I don't think I've met you before, Rachel Lin, is that how you pronounce it? Glad to have you with us. Yeah, unmute yourself so you can talk. Okay.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm a nutritionist. And last time, maybe in 2020, they talk about dietary guideline. And the people say, well, the dietary guideline need to address the sustainability of eating. And so recently, there are a lot of webinar and lecture talking about, how to eat sustainably. And basically is the animal, raising the animal produce methane gas, and that's going to deplete the ozone layer, contributed to the ozone layer depletion, and we need to eat less animal. So my question here is, so in other words, eating vegetarian would be more sustainable. And so there was a lot of webinar talking about producing meat in the laboratory, using the 3D printing, and also a lot of webinar were talking about using the vegetable protein to make veggie burger, gluten protein made with chicken leg and all that. My question here basically to everybody is, how many people will accept your dietary behavior, change for the sustainability to eat veggie burger, Beyond Burger, gluten produced chicken leg? How many people?
The new impossible chicken, huh?
Yeah, impossible chicken.
I don't know.
And also, how much raising animal would contribute to the ozone layer depletion in comparison to all others? So my question is, in order to address sustainability, we need to have our personal sacrifice, and we will, but to what extent? Question is for everybody.
I'd a lot rather that everybody else did this, not me.
I could like to speak to that, since I have done some investigations. Actually, it's not depletion of the ozone layer. It's the contribution to global warming that comes particularly with eating beef. It's very close correlation between what is the healthiest food to eat, which is fish, and of animal or flesh to eat. They don't need to call it meat, and then chicken, and then pork, and then beef being the most environmentally harmful. The question I don't fully understand, I've had other people give me issues about that, is that the energy required to make Beyond Beef and these things is also complex. People try to say, okay, I'm going to get by, I'm going to become a local person, a localvorous, and that becomes difficult sometimes, because it's sometimes easier to raise tomatoes in Oregon or in the north compared to the south, where a lot of chemicals have to be added to take care of the fungus. And so you're going to eat organic. Well, they don't eat organic don't eat organic tomatoes from Louisiana. They're not good. So I guess you have to think the transportation cost, which actually are not that, are fairly trivial in terms of transporting because of efficiencies. But it's a complicated issue, but I agree that eating simpler would have environmental benefits. That is to say, eating more plant compared to animal, and in the order I gave.
And if I can jump in here, I think part of the key here is incremental steps and moderation. I like steak as much as the next person. I think it's great, but that doesn't mean that I have to have it every day. So I guess when I talk to my friends who don't want to take steps to address climate change, they usually seem to see it as an all or nothing person. Like, if I start to care about climate change, I have to become a vegan. Like, no, you don't. Maybe you have chicken more often than you have beef, and you might try some tofu sometime. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing sort of thing. If everyone starts taking incremental steps, then it can make some difference.
Very good. It's a real challenge for us. Thank you for throwing that out. All right. I think we've gone on fairly long here. Anyone else have a quick comment or question? If not, Rachel and Louise, any final summary or nugget that you'd like the rest of us to leave with here before we sign off?
Rachel?
I guess my closing thought would be that really our goal with this article was to understand and to promote what we talked about, the hermeneutic of charity, that in all of our interpreting scripture, interpreting science, interpreting the world around us, that we try to do it in love to other people. So I guess that's my call to action, is that in all of our conversations surrounding climate change or anything else, that we really try to act in love and charity to those around us, remembering the least of these and trying to understand where other people are coming from rather than pointing fingers.
Louise?
If you feel compelled to do something about climate change or any other issues, may I encourage you to prayerfully find opportunities to talk to somebody about this. Maybe not just talk to somebody who have the same view as you, but somebody actually who thinks differently. And that could be a bridge building process, and that can grow. And it is Rachel and my hope that we will be successful in the coming days in building more bridges than not.
Right. Okay. So with that, I think I'd like to close the meeting, and I want to thank you again, Rachel and Louise, for joining us, for sharing your lives with us, and for sharing your thoughts, and for writing the article. And thank all of you for joining, for your discussion, your comments, and hope to see you next month when you, Carol, well, you're going to be in the spotlight on October 9, and hope to see all of you back. Okay. Goodbye.